The sun was high and hot in the sky, beating down on the crowded streets of the city. People were walking in every direction, cars honking as they moved slowly through the traffic, and the smell of food from street vendors mixed with the dust and heat in the air. In the middle of all this, a large black man moved at a steady pace, carrying grocery bags in both hands. He was not in a hurry, but he was careful, making sure not to bump into anyone or drop what he had bought. His face was calm, almost serene as he took each step with a quiet confidence. The man had been through enough to know how to keep to himself in busy places. He had learned over time how to read the streets, how to notice the little things that most people ignored, like how certain people walked, where the shadows fell, and which areas made him feel uneasy. Today, the city felt tense. He could feel it in the way people moved, the way cars slowed down too quickly, and the way a group of young men near a corner were whispering and watching him. He ignored it all and focused on his path, turning into a side street that would take him closer to home. The street was quieter than the main road, but not empty. A few people were sitting on benches trying to stay out of the sun, and some children ran around laughing and playing. The man walked past them without a glance, his mind focused on the steps ahead. But then he noticed a group of police officers approaching from the far end of the street. There were 3 of them, moving quickly, eyes scanning everything around them. The man's instincts told him to stay calm and keep walking. He knew from experience that sudden movements or eye contact could be misread. He continued on, holding his grocery bags firmly, feeling the heat of the day on his back. One officer separated from the others and started moving towards him. The man kept his eyes forward, trying to appear non-threatening. But the officer's steps were quick and purposeful, and the man could hear the sound of his boots against the concrete. When the officer reached him, he stopped abruptly and said something in a sharp, commanding tone. The words were hard to understand at first, but the message was clear. He wanted the man to stop. The man raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace and compliance. He spoke in a calm voice, explaining that he was just walking home and carrying groceries. But the officer didn't seem to hear him. His face was tense, his jaw tight, and his eyes were narrow. He seemed to see threat where there was none. The man could feel the situation getting worse, but he kept his calm. He knew that showing fear or anger would only make things worse. So he stayed still, let the officer come closer, and tried to explain again. Suddenly, the officer reached out and grabbed one of the grocery bags. The man tried to hold it, but the officer's grip was strong. People on the street started to notice. Some froze in shock. Others pulled out their phones, and a few started to move closer, unsure if they should intervene. The man's heart rate increased, but he didn't panic. He had faced tense situations before and knew that staying level-headed was his best chance to get through this. The officer pulled harder, and the bag tore slightly, spilling some of the groceries onto the ground. The man bent down quickly, picking up what he could. He didn't want to fight, but he also didn't want to give up. He tried to move away slowly, hoping the officer would let him go. But the officer wasn't backing down. Another officer arrived, and then another, surrounding the man. The street seemed to close in on him. People stopped what they were doing to watch, whispers spreading among the small crowd that had formed. The man took a deep breath, speaking calmly but firmly. He asked the officers why they were treating him this way, reminding them that he hadn't done anything wrong. The first officer didn't respond, just moved closer, his body language aggressive. The man's mind was working quickly. He knew he couldn't let panic take over. He had to think fast, act carefully, and stay composed. He subtly adjusted his stance, making sure he wasn't cornered, keeping his body balanced so he could react if needed. Then, without warning, one of the officers reached for him more forcefully. The man's instincts kicked in. He moved slightly, using his size to shift the officer off balance without hurting him. The other officers stepped in, thinking he was resisting. But the man didn't fight. He stayed calm, guiding the movements around him in a way that looked like struggle but was actually controlled. He was aware of every step, every angle, every person watching. He wanted them to think they were in control while he quietly planned his next move. People in the crowd began to murmur, some gasping, others whispering to each other. No one stepped forward, but everyone was watching, sensing that something unusual was happening. The man's calm presence in the middle of the chaos made him stand out. He didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't act aggressively. He simply stayed steady, letting the officers think they were winning. The scene was tense. the heat of the day mixing with the rising tension in the air. The officers pushed him a little further, and he allowed it, keeping his movements deliberate and controlled. He knew they underestimated him, assuming that his size made him easy to overpower. They didn't realize that he had been observing them, learning their patterns, understanding how they reacted under stress. Each move he made was a part of a larger plan, though the officers had no idea. To them it looked like a simple scuffle, a routine encounter escalating unexpectedly. But in reality, the man was always one step ahead. At one point he shifted slightly, guiding the first officer into a position that blocked the others. The officers didn't notice at first, too focused on the immediate struggle. But the man had created a small opening, a moment of advantage that he could use later. He continued to speak calmly, trying to reason with them, appealing to whatever sense of decency they might have. His voice was steady, almost soothing, a stark contrast to the aggression surrounding him. By now the crowd had grown slightly. Some people whispered encouragement. Some criticized the officers, but no one stepped into the street. The man remained focused, aware that any sudden action could change everything. He knew the officers were frustrated, their patience thin. They were confident, thinking that his size made him dangerous, that he would fight back. They didn't realize that his calmness, his control, and his intelligence were his true strengths. The sun continued to beat down, sweat forming on the man's forehead, but he remained composed. He adjusted his stance subtly, keeping balance, controlling his breathing, and observing the officers' reactions. Every twitch, every glance, every slight movement was noted. He was learning as much from them as they thought they were learning from him. This was not just a struggle of strength, but a battle of observation, patience, and strategy. Suddenly, one of the officers shouted, calling for backup from the other side of the street. The man didn't flinch. He continued to act as though he was simply caught in an unfortunate situation, allowing the officers to believe they had the upper hand. But in his mind, he was already planning the next steps, the moves that would turn the situation around. He knew he had to remain calm, act innocent, and let their own aggression and overconfidence work against them. The tension in the street was thick, and every person watching could feel it. Children stopped playing, vendors paused their work, and passers-by slowed down, sensing that something important was unfolding. The man's steady presence in the middle of the chaos drew attention, making it clear that this was not a random encounter. His calmness in the face of aggression was unusual, even mesmerizing, and it kept the officers off balance without them realizing it. As more officers arrived, the man's mind remained sharp. He knew he could not escape by force alone. He needed to think, plan, and guide the situation carefully. He continued to speak in a calm, firm tone, making small gestures that appeared non-threatening but were actually part of his strategy. He let the officers feel in control, let them believe that their actions were succeeding while he quietly mapped out how to turn the tables. The street was hot, the crowd tense, and the scene chaotic, but the man's focus never wavered. This moment, though it seemed ordinary to some, was the beginning of a series of events that would change everything. The man, unassuming in appearance, was about to show that appearances could be deceiving. He was not just a man carrying groceries on a hot day. He was someone who understood the power of calm, the strength in observation, and the advantage of being underestimated. And as the officers continued to press, unaware of what was coming, the stage was set for a remarkable story of intelligence, patience, and resilience. The man felt the tension in the air grow thicker as more officers arrived on the street. Each new arrival added to the noise, the shouts, and the confusion, but he stayed calm, moving with a quiet, controlled awareness. His mind was working faster than ever, observing every movement, every expression, and every moment of hesitation from the officers. He had always been good at reading people, and he knew how to recognize fear, overconfidence, and doubt. Right now they were full of overconfidence, thinking that his size and the chaos surrounding him gave them the advantage. The crowd had grown as well. People from nearby shops and houses peeked from windows and doorways. Some stepped closer, phones raised, ready to record if anything happened. The man noticed them but did not let it distract him. He had learned to focus on what mattered most in tense situations, the people directly involved and the immediate surroundings. He shifted slightly, guiding the officers' movements subtly without them realizing it. They thought they were controlling the situation, but in reality he was shaping it. One officer lunged forward again, trying to force him against a wall. The man leaned back just enough to avoid the push but kept his hands raised to show compliance. He spoke in a calm voice, asking why they were treating him like this, appealing to whatever sense of reason they might have. The officer ignored him, barking commands and shouting threats. But the man did not flinch. He had seen this before, seen how aggression often overcompensates for weakness or uncertainty. He waited, patient and steady, for the right moment. He had noticed small patterns in their behavior over the weeks. When they got frustrated, they tended to overreach, make mistakes, and act impulsively. When they thought someone was weak, they tried to assert control with unnecessary force. These were all tools he could use. He kept his body loose, ready to react, but always in a controlled way. Every step, every movement was deliberate. To the officers, it looked like resistance and stubbornness. To him, it was strategy and preparation. The officer in front of him raised a hand as if to strike, but the man anticipated the movement. He shifted his weight slightly, causing the officer to lose balance for a split second. That was all the opening he needed. He gently pushed back, not with anger but with precision, guiding the officer toward the side and creating space behind him. The other officers were momentarily distracted by the sudden motion, giving him a few critical seconds to adjust his position. His calmness was his shield, his awareness his weapon. As the struggle continued, the man's mind raced through possible outcomes. He could have chosen to fight back, to let his size intimidate them, but he knew that would escalate things dangerously. Instead, he focused on making the officers reveal themselves, their mistakes, and their weaknesses. Every shove, every grab, every word shouted was recorded in his memory, a map of their behavior and overconfidence. He was gathering evidence without a camera, preparing for the moment when everything would turn in his favor. The crowd around him was whispering now, some in fear, some in disbelief. A few people tried to move closer to help, but the officer's presence kept them back. The man noticed every face, every reaction. He understood the power of witnesses, how a calm person in a chaotic scene could inspire observation and accountability. He kept talking, asking questions, appealing to reason, his voice steady and clear. The officers, frustrated, ignored him, believing he was just trying to stall or manipulate. Little did they know he was already several steps ahead. A small child appeared at the edge of the street, tugging at a parent's sleeve. The man glanced at them for a moment, offering a reassuring nod. He wanted to show he meant no harm, that he was not a threat. This simple gesture contrasted sharply with the aggressive behavior of the officers, making the scene even more striking to the witnesses. His calm humanity stood out in a moment where tension and aggression dominated. It reminded people watching that he was just a man, not a danger, not a criminal, not someone to fear. The officers, meanwhile, were getting more frustrated. Their commands grew louder, their gestures sharper, their bodies tense. They didn't notice the small openings forming around them, the subtle shifts in positioning that the man was using to guide their movements. He allowed them to believe they were controlling him, all the while positioning them in a way that would later expose their mistakes. Each overreach, each impulsive move worked in his favor. He was patient, knowing that the right moment to act would come. He had planned for situations like this before. Not exactly this one, but moments of confrontation. Moments where his presence alone could force others to reveal their true character. He had learned that calmness and observation often outweighed brute strength or immediate reaction. And now, on this hot street surrounded by witnesses and aggressive officers, his patience was his greatest asset. He stayed in control of his breathing, his voice, and his posture. Every movement was deliberate, precise, and careful. One of the officers tried to grab his arm to pull him forward, but the man leaned just enough to avoid a strong grip. Instead of resisting violently, he used the officer's momentum to guide him slightly to the side. The other officers reacted instinctively, moving to intercept. He allowed it, keeping his movements minimal, making sure not to escalate but subtly shaping the scene. To an outsider, it looked like a man being overwhelmed by force. In reality, he was orchestrating the moment, positioning each officer where he wanted them. As minutes passed, the man noticed small details that others might miss. A slip on the sidewalk, a distraction in the crowd, a moment of hesitation from an officer. Each of these moments was recorded in his mind as part of a larger plan. He stayed calm, letting them think they were winning while he prepared for the next stage. He was not acting out of fear nor out of anger. He was acting with precision, patience, and awareness, turning the situation into a controlled experiment of human behavior. The officers were beginning to show signs of fatigue, frustration, and overconfidence. They assumed their numbers and aggression gave them control, but they didn't realize that the man's calm presence and awareness were slowly turning the tide. He noticed their patterns, their impulses, and their assumptions. He kept speaking, asking questions, making observations, all in a calm and non-threatening tone. Each word he spoke highlighted his control and intelligence, contrasting sharply with the officer's impulsive aggression. Then, as one officer lunged again, the man subtly sidestepped, guiding him toward a position where his actions would be visible to everyone watching. The moment was carefully calculated. He didn't strike, didn't resist violently, didn't scream. He simply moved, controlled, calm, and precise. To the witnesses, it looked like a struggle, but they could sense the difference. There was a deliberate intelligence in his movements, a quiet confidence that made him stand out in the chaos. The street was now filled with tension. People whispered, phones recorded, and the air was thick with anticipation. The man remained steady, calm, and observant, letting the officers think they were in control while he quietly mapped out the unfolding events. Every mistake they made, every overreach, every moment of frustration added to the scenario he was building. He was patient, knowing that this moment of confrontation would lead to something much larger if handled correctly. As the scene continued, the man realized he had to guide the officers into a more advantageous position, one that would allow him to reveal their mistakes fully. He began to subtly shift his stance, using his size and presence to influence their movements without them noticing. Each step was deliberate, each movement calculated, and each glance carefully timed. He stayed calm, keeping his voice steady and his hands non-threatening, making sure that the officers continued to underestimate him. The crowd around him could sense that something unusual was happening. They watched closely, some whispering to each other, others holding their breath. The man's calm and steady presence in the middle of chaos created a contrast that was impossible to ignore. To the officers, it was an annoyance, a minor obstacle to overcome. To the witnesses, it was a moment of fascination, a glimpse of intelligence and strategy in an unexpected place. The man continued to observe, plan, and adjust. He was fully aware that every action, every word, and every gesture mattered. He stayed calm, let the officers feel in control and use their aggression against them. He had no intention of harming them, but he intended to reveal their overconfidence, their mistakes, and their lack of awareness. The moment was carefully controlled, and he was fully in charge of how it unfolded, even if no one else could see it yet. The man could feel the officers' frustration building with every passing second. Their faces were tight with tension, their movements sharp and impatient. He knew that their overconfidence was growing as well. They believed that they had the situation under control, that his calm demeanor was simply fear or submission. But in reality, he was quietly guiding every step, every reaction, every misstep they made. He allowed them to think they were in charge while he prepared to shift the balance. He noticed the street around him, the buildings, the cars parked along the curb, the narrow alleyways nearby. Each detail mattered. He saw the small crowd of people still watching from a safe distance, some whispering to each other, some taking videos on their phones. Their presence was important. He needed witnesses to ensure that what was happening could not be hidden or twisted later. He kept a calm, neutral expression as he moved slightly, creating just enough space between himself and the officers to maintain control over his surroundings. The first officer lunged forward again, this time more aggressively. The man stepped back slightly, letting the officer's momentum carry him past, and then gently guided him into a position where the other officer's view was blocked. They didn't notice it at first, but he was slowly creating small openings that would soon be crucial. He spoke softly, almost apologetically to the officers, trying to make them think he was just trying to reason with them, not manipulate them. The contrast between his calm words and their aggressive shouts made him seem even less threatening. The officers tried to coordinate, but their confusion grew. They shouted commands to each other, gesturing and pointing, but their communication was fragmented. The man observed every gesture, memorizing their positions and predicting their next moves. He had done this before in different ways with different people. His size and calm demeanor were his tools, but his mind was the real advantage. Each officer moved as he expected, reinforcing the pattern he had anticipated. He noticed a small alley to his left, partially hidden by parked cars. If he could maneuver the officers closer to it, it would limit their ability to call for backup quickly and give him a chance to control the flow of the situation. He moved carefully, taking small measured steps that appeared unintentional, almost as if he were being pushed. But each step was deliberate. The officers followed, thinking they were surrounding him, while he was leading them exactly where he wanted. A few bystanders whispered excitedly, sensing the unfolding drama. Some tried to get a closer look, but the man subtly adjusted his position to ensure they were safe and that the officers' movements remained predictable. He did not want unnecessary violence, but he also needed the officers to make mistakes. He could not force them. He had to guide them naturally. His calm presence and careful movements were all part of a larger plan, one that relied on observation, patience, and intelligence. The first officer tried to grab him again, but the man stepped aside, using the officer's own force against him. It was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but it shifted the officer slightly out of alignment. The other officers reacted instinctively, moving to block or intercept, which placed them in positions that limited their control. The man allowed it to happen. He did not resist with aggression. He let their own energy create the openings he needed. The scene looked chaotic, but in reality, he was directing the flow like a conductor with an orchestra. He spoke again, his voice calm and steady, asking simple questions about why they were acting this way, reminding them that he had done nothing wrong. His words cut through the tension, and he could see a flicker of doubt in one officer's eyes. That moment, though brief, was important. It reminded him that even in moments of aggression, reason could take hold. He continued to guide the situation subtly, never raising his voice, never showing fear, never giving them a reason to suspect that he had a plan beyond patience and observation. The officers began to cluster slightly closer together, following him without realizing it. He saw the advantage forming. With each step he took, they were guided into positions where they were visible to the crowd and to anyone observing from nearby buildings. He was creating a situation where their aggression would be exposed, where their overconfidence would become their weakness. He remained calm, aware of every small movement, every twitch of muscle, every glance between the officers. One officer tried to intimidate him by stepping closer, shouting, and gesturing forcefully. The man did not flinch. Instead, he adjusted his stance slightly, leaning forward just enough to appear compliant while subtly nudging the officer toward a narrow gap between parked cars. The other officers followed instinctively, not realizing that they were now in a confined space where their movements were restricted. The man's calmness contrasted sharply with their growing frustration and impatience. It was becoming clear, even to the bystanders, that he was in control in a way that they could not understand. The air was thick with tension. People in the crowd whispered, gasped, and held their phones steady, capturing every moment. The man continued to observe, using every detail to anticipate the next move. He had no intention of using unnecessary force. He wanted to expose the officers' mistakes and show the truth of what was happening. His calm demeanor made him appear almost serene, while the officers' agitation made their actions look reckless and poorly judged. He guided them further, subtly influencing their steps, their balance, and their coordination. Each officer's impatience worked in his favor, as did their overconfidence. He kept speaking calmly, asking questions, pointing out small details in his voice that made them think he was trying to reason with them rather than manipulate them. The crowd's attention grew, and the man could sense the moment approaching when the situation would shift definitively in his favor. The officers, now clustered near the narrow alley, were focused entirely on controlling him, not realizing that their movements had been carefully influenced. The man's size, calm demeanor, and intelligence had led them exactly where he wanted. He remained still for a moment, letting them adjust, observing their body language and predicting their next moves. He was ready to act, but only when the time was right. Patience was crucial. Any sudden move now could ruin the careful positioning he had achieved. A few neighbors began to peek from windows above, sensing the unusual situation. The man knew that witnesses were essential, not just for validation, but for safety. He subtly adjusted his stance to make sure the officers remained in full view, making their aggressive behavior undeniable to anyone watching. His calmness in the face of aggression continued to highlight the contrast between him and the officers, drawing the attention of the crowd and ensuring that their actions could not be easily dismissed. He allowed the first officer to take a step too close, then gently shifted his weight, causing a minor stumble that went unnoticed by the officers themselves. The movement was subtle, but it disrupted their balance and coordination. The other officers reacted instinctively, moving to compensate, which further limited their options. The man's control over the situation increased with every calculated step. He did not strike, did not shout, did not panic. He simply remained present, aware, and steady. The narrow alley now became the focal point of the encounter. The man had guided the officers there without them realizing it. Their overconfidence and aggression had led them into a position where their movements were restricted, their mistakes visible, and their judgment flawed. The crowd continued to watch, sensing the shift in power even if they did not understand it fully. The man's calm presence and quiet intelligence were the key elements in turning the situation around, and he was ready to take the next step when the moment arrived. He continued to speak softly, asking questions that seemed innocent but served to highlight the officers' poor decisions. Each word, each gesture, each step was calculated to maintain the appearance of compliance, while subtly guiding them further into the trap. The tension on the street was palpable. Every bystander could feel it, every officer could feel it, but only the man fully understood the unfolding dynamic. He remained the eye of the storm, calm, composed, and fully aware of his control over the situation. The man felt the moment had arrived. The officers were now positioned exactly as he had hoped, crowded near the narrow alley, their movements limited, their overconfidence fully exposed. Their aggression, which they had believed would intimidate him, had actually trapped them. Every subtle shift, every careful step he had made over the past tense minutes had brought them here. The witnesses around the street could sense the shift in power, though they did not yet understand how carefully it had been orchestrated. He remained calm, his breathing steady, hands relaxed, but ready. He looked around, taking in the crowd and the environment. The neighbors peeking from windows, people holding phones, children hiding behind parents. All were silent observers of the unfolding situation. The man knew that the presence of witnesses was important. It made the officers accountable, and it made sure that any missteps would be undeniable. He spoke softly, again asking simple questions about why they were acting so aggressively. His voice, calm and steady, cut through the noise and drew attention to the irrationality of their behavior. The first officer lunged forward once more, frustration written across his face. The man did not react violently. Instead, he gently shifted his weight, causing the officer to stumble slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it disrupted their coordination and drew the others into awkward positions. Each officer's movement was now guided by his calm control, every action revealing their mistakes to the watching crowd. They still thought they were in control, but their overconfidence had been turned against them. A neighbor finally stepped forward, speaking to one of the officers, questioning their actions. The officer barely noticed, too focused on the man in front of him. But this small interaction drew more attention from the crowd. Others began to whisper, murmurs spreading through the street about what was happening. The man remained calm, watching the officers, letting them continue their aggressive gestures while the public slowly realized the truth. He didn't need to raise his voice or strike. The situation was already exposing itself naturally. The man's mind worked quickly, anticipating the next As one officer tried to block him from moving back, but he guided the officer's energy subtly, causing the body to overextend. The other officers reacted, attempting to intercept, but the space around them was narrow, restricting their movements. The man had effectively turned their aggression into a tool, creating a situation where they were visibly clumsy and overpowered by their own frustration. To anyone watching, it was clear that their conduct was reckless and unjustified. He glanced at the spilled groceries from earlier, quietly picking up a few items and placing them back into his bag. The small act of calm, everyday behavior contrasted sharply with the officer's agitation. It made the scene more striking to the witnesses, emphasizing that he was simply a man trying to go about his day, while the officer's aggressive behavior stood out as unreasonable. He spoke again softly, questioning their actions, appealing to common sense, all while keeping his movements smooth and controlled. The officers' shouting grew louder, their gestures more exaggerated. They did not notice that their behavior was now being recorded from multiple angles. The crowd was growing, people holding up phones ready to capture every moment. The man subtly adjusted his position to ensure that all the officer's actions were fully visible, making sure there was no hiding the truth. His calm intelligence turned a dangerous encounter into a display of accountability, showing that patience and awareness could overpower force. One officer tried to grab him aggressively, but he leaned slightly, guiding the officer off balance. The stumble was small, almost invisible, but it disrupted the flow of the other's coordination. The man spoke in a calm tone, asking why they were acting this way, why they assumed he was a threat. His words were simple, human, and non-threatening. Yet, in the context of the officer's aggressive behavior, they highlighted the contrast sharply. The witnesses could now see the situation for what it was: a man remaining calm and composed in the face of unnecessary aggression. The man knew that this was the moment where the situation would turn completely. He had positioned the officers so that any aggressive move they made would be exposed to the public. He stayed composed, breathing steadily, his calm demeanor radiating control. He continued to speak, subtly emphasizing their mistakes without directly confronting them. His strategy relied on patience and observation, not confrontation. The officers, blinded by anger and frustration, had fallen into his trap without realizing it. The crowd began to murmur more audibly, recognizing the imbalance. Some questioned the officers, others whispered encouragement to the man. The situation had shifted from a potential violent encounter to a public demonstration of intelligence, control, and accountability. The man remained calm, carefully observing each officer, noting their mistakes and positioning. He did not need to fight. He simply needed to stay composed while the environment exposed the truth. The officers tried to regain control, but the narrow alley and the crowd's attention limited their options. Every movement they made now looked clumsy and unnecessary. The man guided their energy subtly, allowing their aggression to reveal their mistakes. He was calm, collected, and unthreatening, and yet he was in complete control of the dynamics around him. Each small shift in their position and balance increased the visibility of their misconduct to the watching crowd. He spoke again softly, asking questions that seemed innocent but made the officers pause, highlighting the absurdity of their actions. The first officer stumbled slightly again, the others reacting instinctively. The crowd could now see how their aggression had put them in awkward, exposed positions. The man's strategy of calmness and awareness had worked perfectly, turning a dangerous confrontation into a scenario where the officer's own behavior was on display. The witnesses understood without needing explanation that the man had orchestrated the situation carefully and skillfully. A few more neighbors leaned out from windows, finally recognizing what was happening. The man adjusted his stance to ensure the officers remained fully visible, his calm demeanor emphasizing the contrast between him and their aggression. Every gesture and word of the officers was now clear to the witnesses. The man continued to speak softly, calmly, questioning their assumptions and behavior, all while maintaining control over his own actions. He did not raise his voice, did not react with anger, and did not attempt to escape. He simply let their own behavior reveal itself. The officers, now frustrated and flustered, did not realize how fully they had been guided into this position. The man's calmness had created openings that forced them to act in ways that exposed their mistakes. Every aggressive movement was now visible to the growing crowd. Witnesses recorded videos, whispered to each other, and watched intently. The man's intelligence and awareness had turned a dangerous, tense encounter into a scenario of public accountability. He continued to adjust subtly, guiding the officers' energy and movements without force. Every action, every glance, every step was carefully calculated to maintain control while exposing their overconfidence. The street was tense but safe, the crowd fully aware that the man had turned the situation in his favor without escalating violence. His calmness was the key, his awareness the weapon, and his patience the shield. The officers, blinded by their own assumptions, had fallen completely into the trap he had set. Finally, the man allowed the officers a moment of pause, standing still and composed, hands relaxed at his sides. The witnesses could see the contrast. One man calm, composed, and aware, and several officers aggressive, frustrated, and exposed. The dynamics had shifted completely. The man's plan, executed through observation, patience, and subtle guidance, had worked. The officers' behavior had been revealed, their overconfidence and aggression fully exposed. The moment had been turned from potential violence to public accountability, and the man remained composed, ready to guide the situation to its final resolution. The moment of calm did not last long, but it was enough. The officers were visibly frustrated, their aggressive postures betraying confusion and fatigue. The crowd had grown larger and people were whispering to each other, sharing what they had seen unfold. Phones recorded every detail. The man remained composed, moving carefully, observing and speaking softly, each word deliberate. He was aware that the presence of witnesses made a difference. This was no longer just about survival. It was about exposing the truth, showing the world how quickly assumptions and aggression could lead to mistakes. The officers tried to regain control, shouting commands, gesturing and moving closer. The man adjusted his stance slightly, guiding them subtly without confrontation. Each movement forced them to overextend, making their aggression more obvious to the onlookers. The narrow alley and the positioning of the officers created a visual trap. Their every step seemed clumsy, their reactions exaggerated, their control slipping further away. The man did not need to raise his voice, push, or strike. His calm awareness was enough to shift the balance completely. A bystander called out to the officers, questioning why they were acting aggressively. The officers barely acknowledged the comment, too focused on the man. But the small interruption drew more attention from the crowd, and soon whispers of disbelief spread. The man noticed and subtly adjusted his movements to ensure the officers remained fully visible. Their actions, previously unnoticed, were now clearly on display. Every aggressive gesture, every misjudged step, and every frustrated shout became evidence of their misconduct. The man allowed the first officer to take a step too close. He leaned gently to the side, letting the officer stumble slightly. The other officers reacted instinctively, moving to compensate, which placed them in positions that further exposed their lack of control. The crowd noticed the awkwardness, the imbalance, and the overreaction. The man's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with their agitation, highlighting his control over the situation without a single act of violence. Every observer could see the intelligence and patience guiding his actions. He spoke softly, asking questions that seemed innocent, but subtly forced the officers to reveal their assumptions. Why had they assumed he was a threat? Why had they approached him so aggressively? His voice remained calm even and human, creating a stark contrast to the officers' angry, impatient tones. Each word emphasized the irrationality of their behavior, and each pause allowed the crowd to absorb what was happening. The man's strategy was working perfectly. Their own actions were exposing them. The crowd around the street grew more confident. People leaned out from windows. Others approached cautiously, and a few shouted encouragement. The man continued to observe, adjust, and guide without aggression. His movements were minimal but purposeful, each subtle adjustment controlling the flow of the officers' actions. The narrow alley kept them confined, limiting their ability to react freely. Their overconfidence, which had initially been a weapon against him, had now become their weakness. The officers, increasingly frustrated, tried to coordinate more aggressively, but their energy worked against them. The man stayed calm, letting each mistake happen naturally. He did not push, pull, or retaliate. He only remained aware, composed, and intelligent in his approach. The witnesses could see the difference clearly. One man calm and controlled versus several officers frustrated, reckless, and exposed. The visual contrast was undeniable, and the story of the encounter began to take shape on the street and in the recordings being made. One officer reached for him with force again. The man stepped lightly to the side, using the officer's momentum to shift him slightly off balance. The other officers reacted instinctively, trying to regain control, which only further revealed their lack of coordination. The man spoke again softly, pointing out details and asking questions that challenged their assumptions. Every word was calm, neutral, and human, yet every phrase exposed their flaws. The crowd sensed the intelligence behind his actions, recognizing that his calmness was strategic and deliberate. The street seemed to hold its breath. The tension was high, but the man's presence brought focus and clarity. People watched as he carefully guided the officers' energy, subtly adjusting their positions without any aggression. Each step they took now seemed to highlight their mistakes, and the crowd responded. Whispers turned into comments, comments into observations, and soon it was clear to everyone that the man was controlling the situation in ways the officers could not understand. He noticed a small opening to the side of the alley, partially visible to the crowd. He shifted slightly, guiding the officer's attention toward it, forcing them into a position where their movements became even more constrained. Each officer's aggressive attempt to regain control now played out in full view of the witnesses. The man remained calm, his body relaxed, his breathing steady. He had turned the scenario into a stage where their actions revealed their overconfidence, bias, and lack of awareness. The crowd absorbed it all, the story unfolding clearly before them. The officers were now visibly disoriented, their attempts at control ineffective. They moved impulsively, frustrated, and increasingly aware that their plan had failed. The man remained composed, allowing each action, each stumble, and each overreach to expose them further. His strategy relied on observation, patience, and calm intelligence. The witnesses could see it. They could see the difference between reckless aggression and controlled awareness. His actions were deliberate but human, his movements subtle but commanding. Finally, the man allowed the officers a pause. He stood still, relaxed, hands at his sides. The crowd could see clearly. One man, calm and in control, versus several officers, frustrated, exposed, and clumsy. The dynamics had shifted completely. His patient strategy, based on observation and careful guidance, had revealed the officer's misconduct without a single act of unnecessary violence. Every witness understood that he had orchestrated the scenario with intelligence and patience. The officers attempted to regain authority, but the crowd's presence and the man's calm demeanor prevented them from acting freely. Every aggressive gesture was now visible, recorded, and witnessed. The man had turned the situation from a potential confrontation into a moment of public accountability. He spoke softly, humanly, asking questions and making observations that highlighted their mistakes. The officers' overconfidence, frustration, and aggression were fully exposed. The crowd absorbed it all, realizing the truth of the encounter. The man then slowly adjusted his groceries, arranging them carefully, showing that he meant no harm, that he was simply a man going about his day. This simple act contrasted sharply with the officer's agitation, further emphasizing the imbalance. The crowd whispered, recorded, and observed. The officers, realizing that they had been outmaneuvered, looked around uncertainly. The man's calm intelligence had won the encounter, and the witnesses understood it fully. As the situation finally began to settle, some neighbors stepped forward to speak to the officers, questioning their actions and demanding explanations. The crowd's attention, combined with recordings and witness accounts, ensured that the officers could not ignore the consequences. The man remained calm, human, and composed, showing strength not through violence but through awareness, patience, and strategy. His actions had turned a dangerous situation into a powerful example of intelligence, observation, and calm courage. The officers eventually backed away, realizing that their aggression had failed. The man, composed and unthreatening, collected his remaining groceries and began walking calmly toward home. The crowd followed at a distance, whispering and recording, sharing the story of what had just happened. His calmness and intelligence had turned the scenario from a potential act of violence into a story of accountability and awareness. The man walked steadily, the heat of the day no longer a concern. As the lesson of the encounter became clear, patience, observation, and calm awareness could turn aggression and overconfidence into exposure and justice. The street slowly returned to normal, but the story of the encounter spread quickly. People talked about it for days, sharing videos recounting the intelligence and calm of the man who had faced aggression without fear. His calm presence, strategic patience, and human-centered awareness had made him the unlikely hero of a tense street encounter. And as he continued his walk home, groceries in hand, the man felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had faced danger, outsmarted aggression, and shown that calm intelligence and human awareness were far stronger than force or overconfidence.